Today, we're diving into a book that's about 1,000 years old, but has the power to completely change how we think about the history of love. It's an absolute masterpiece from Muslim Spain that acts as this incredible cultural bridge between the East and the West, and it raises some really provocative questions about one of our most treasured literary traditions.
So, when you think of courtly love, what comes to mind? Probably European nights, right? Troubadours, damsels in distress, the whole scene. But what if that's only half the story? What if one of the most important books on the subject, one that actually came before all those famous European works, was from a totally different world? Well, that's the big question at the heart of our explainer today.
All right, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll get into the whole courtly love mystery. Then, we're going to meet the brilliant and pretty controversial author Ibn Hazm. After that, we'll take a look inside his amazing book, The Ring of the Dove. And finally, we'll explore why it's seen as this incredible bridge between two worlds.
Okay, Section 1, the courtly love mystery. We all know the classic story, don't we? This tradition of romantic devotion that basically shaped so much of Western literature, from King Arthur all the way to modern romance novels. But where this powerful idea actually came from is still something scholars fiercely debate. So while the popular story gives credit to sources like classical Latin and Celtic traditions, there's this other major theory out there, the Hispano-Arabic hypothesis. It basically suggests that the super sophisticated love poetry and philosophy from Al-Andalus, that's Muslim Spain, had a huge influence on the European troubadours. It's one of the most promising, but you better believe it, it's also one of the most contested ideas in medieval studies.
To really get that theory, we have to meet our main character. Section 2, let's meet the rebel author Ibn Hazm. He was born in Cordoba way back in 994, and he was, without a doubt, one of the greatest scholars of Muslim Spain, but also one of its most controversial figures. He was a philosopher, a poet, a historian, a theologian, and his ideas were so out there for his time that his opponents actually held public book burnings of his work.
And his life, it was a total roller coaster. He was born into the political elite, he even became prime minister, but then the government collapsed and he found himself thrown in prison. It was only after this political disaster that he really turned to scholarship, and around 1027 he wrote his most famous book about love. But his challenging views eventually got him kicked out of several cities, and he actually died in exile. This was a man who truly lived and wrote on the edge. And get this, the man was unbelievably prolific. His own son figured that Ibn Hazm wrote around 400 volumes of work. That adds up to something like 80,000 pages. To put that into perspective, that's a level of writing that's pretty much unmatched by any other scholar in Muslim history. He was an absolute force of nature. So, when his enemies burned his books, this was his response. This quote just captures his defined spirit perfectly. He's basically saying, "Go ahead, burn the paper, but you can't burn what's inside me." It's such a powerful statement, and it really tells you everything you need to know about his character. So how does this rebellious spirit come through in his writing? Well, let's find out in Section 3, Inside the Ring of the Dove. What exactly is this book that's fascinated people for centuries? Well, it's not just some collection of poems. It's often described as a psychological treatise on the very nature of love itself. The book is a pioneering work on what's called profane love. Now, that doesn't mean it's vulgar or anything. It just means human, earthly love, as opposed to the divine or mystical love for God that, frankly, was what most people were writing about back then. Ibn Hazm was focused on the psychology and philosophy of real-world relationships, and that was a pretty radical approach. And just listen to how he defines love. He calls it, quote, a conjunction between scattered parts of souls. 1,000 years ago, he was describing what we would now call a soulmate. The idea that love is this kind of spiritual fusion, a reunion of two halves. It feels so incredibly modern, doesn't it?
And almost like a psychologist, Ibn Hazm breaks down the observable symptoms of being in love. He points to things like the lingering gaze, or those sleepless nights spent staring at the stars. But one of his most brilliant insights is what he calls the character shift, how love can turn a coward brave, or make a stingy person suddenly generous, or a stubborn person completely gentle, all for the person they love.
And this wasn't just abstract theory. What made the book so revolutionary was its style. Ibn Hazm basically tossed out the old tradition of just repeating ancient legends. Instead, he filled the book with personal stories about himself, his friends, people he actually knew in Cordova. It gave the whole thing a freshness and a psychological reality that was just totally unique. And all of this brings us to our final section, a bridge between worlds. So,
Given how groundbreaking this book was, what was its impact? This is where we circle back to that big scholarly debate.
So here are the two sides. On one hand, you have the conventional view, which holds that European literature is fundamentally Western. It grew out of its own classical and local traditions. But the Hispano-Arabic hypothesis, which has been championed by scholars like Maria Rosa Menacal, argues that that view is just too narrow. It suggests that Western Europe actually has a mixed ancestry, and that the amazing culture of Muslim Spain was a huge formative part of it.
So, why has this second theory faced so much resistance? Well, scholars point to a few key reasons. First, a historically Eurocentric view of the world. Then there are what they call scholarly double standards, where evidence for Arabic influence has to meet a way higher bar than, say, evidence for Celtic influence. Some argue this bias really took shape during the colonial era, making it hard for people to see a non-European culture as foundational to Western literature. But here's the bottom line. No matter where you land in that academic debate, what's undeniable is how important this book is. The Ring of the Dove is a masterpiece of world literature, period. It gives us this incredibly intimate look into 11th century Cordovan society, and it stands as this powerful cultural bridge connecting medieval Islamic and European thought.
And that leaves us with one final question. You know, the story of Ibn Hazm and his book was almost lost forever. His works were burned, his ideas were suppressed. It really makes you wonder, how many other cultural bridges, just like this one, are out there in our shared history, just waiting for us to discover them and finally cross them?